The WNBA season starts today, and Emily Adler is here to break down the next 2025 preseason predictions. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and happy Friday. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Natalie Heavren, and I'm a features writer and the Atlantic 10 beat reporter for The Next. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Today we'll chat all about the Next and Emily's preseason predictions, take a look back at the preseason, and chat about what excites us about the upcoming season. Joining me today is the Next's Emily Adler, who covers the WNBA at large and college basketball for the Next with a focus on player development and the game behind the game. So before we get started talking about the results, can you give the listeners a brief rundown of how the Next preseason predictions came to be and your process for gathering all this data and then spitting it out into pretty charts that we can all understand?
Yeah, so this is the fourth year that we've done this. I think about 4 years ago, I was basically just curious as to what our internal team would think about, how things were going, and especially in terms of predictions. Just to get a sense, especially because, you had so many, back then you had so many, I think, podcasts that were doing outside of ours, that were doing solid predictions. You had other outlets that were maybe doing preseason power rankings. Maybe occasionally ESPN would do like a roundtable, but I didn't think anything was perfect. This is basically how all my experiments start at here. Nothing was particularly systematized, I think, in a lot of places, and I was curious what that would look like. We are also really unique in that we are not only, our usual tagline, the only 24/7 newsroom covering women's basketball, and only women's basketball at, every level. We specifically are really the only place that covers the WNBA with people on the ground doing, real journalism in every market. And we tend to have a pretty high standard for what we like to do here. And so I was especially, thinking that this is a real opportunity to bring people together because there's often not a lot of opportunities for that, especially internally. And what that's turned into is the preseason predictions. I've honed in different ways over the years, but what it looks like for those who, just looking to read it, it looks like a Google form that is sent out in the Slack. People have a couple weeks to respond. They answer a bunch of questions. It's usually pretty straightforward. I'll tell you, it's a lot more straightforward when you fill out the Google form than it is for me when I am putting it into R and trying to get everything coded so that it actually works out as numbers and nice little pretty charts and graphs. This is, the questions have mutated over the years, but they've mostly stayed the same. Tell me who your title favorites are. Tell me who's going to suck. Maybe go a little bit deeper. Tell me your top two or bottom two, so we can get a good idea of if it's maybe a couple vying for the top spot, if it's only one. Pick some players for awards, and then, let's have some fun at the end.
Who were the collective title favorites, and were they what you were expecting?
I would say it's exactly what I was expecting. This year we had the highest number of responses. We had 16. Usually it's about a dozen or slightly more. We had 16 this year. So you will often get a stray vote here and there on some things. Someone picked, I'm trying to think what the weird ones were. Someone picked like Phoenix for, I think, the worst defense in the league. Sorry. Someone picked Phoenix for the worst offense in the league, which is a little strange because they have Satu and AT and a bunch of shooters. Someone picked Seattle for the worst defense. Seattle has a plus defender at literally every position. So there's a stray vote for Vegas for first, is how I intro this. But otherwise, it's about exactly what you'd expect. All but one vote went to New York or Minnesota for the number one team in the WNBA. These teams literally were one questionable call, a couple missed free throws away from, the title going to one or the other last season. And I would argue Minnesota pretty clearly got better. New York made some moves. If it wasn't for Laney's injury, they probably would have gotten better. But even so, they've retold and probably are about as strong. It's not surprising at all. And it looks exactly the same in the vote share. Really quickly, what vote share means is if you get 100%, it means you're the unanimous favorite. If you're 50%, it means you're the unanimous number two. It's like when you look at Basketball Reference and it's like MVP vote shares. So like both teams are just below 75%, which means they almost got exactly the same votes for first and second place together. It's going to be great. And that's why they were also like by far the top matchup everyone wanted to see in the league.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later on because I always like to know what to circle on my calendar, especially now that we have a 13th team and more games to watch. Who were the collective favorites to finish last, and why do you think those may have been chosen by the voters at the Next?
So we've basically got three clear-cut teams, I think, who are rebuilding either intentionally or accidentally. One of them is literally going to rebuild the entire franchise because the Connecticut Sun are for sale. And then with them, of course, Golden State and the Washington Mystics. You look at these teams, they're really the only teams in the league that, first of all, clear-cut don't have any stars. Clear-cut don't have, a real way to, if not beat, at least challenge the best teams in the league. It just makes sense looking at the rosters. This is kind of what we expected, not only going into the off season, at least once the Tebows were fired, but this is sort of what we expected for a team that in the year 2025 is coming in as an expansion with Golden State. There's not a huge opportunity anymore to draft outright the kinds of players who can still earn you like a very obvious playoff spot as an expansion team. Best case scenario these days, you probably end up like Atlanta, suck really bad, but like with some interesting role players, land the number one pick, you get Angel McCautry, and you make the playoffs. That's probably what Golden State is kind of aiming for. They seem to have a real openings at point guard and center in the lineup, and that's exactly who's atop the draft next year.
And then, you're my go-to person for all things X's and O's. So I'm really interested to know who you think will have the best offense and defense in the league and why, and if that lines up with how we at the Next voted.
I honestly don't recall who I know I voted New York for best defense. They were, I think, second in defensive rating last year. They had Natasha Cloud in place of Courtney Vandersloot. Courtney Vandersloot's, she's not a bad defender, but that's a pretty solid upgrade. Laney's out for the year, which is going to be a big hurt. And Thornton's gone, but Beck Gardner is a great defender. And they really have the depth to be able to rotate people in and out. Especially when you're good enough on offense, it means you don't have to deal with defending in transition. And I think it also felt like a little bit of Minnesota to me was maybe not unsustainable, but they definitely had their own three-point luck. See what happens there. I don't remember who I voted best offense for. I'd be pretty surprised if it was someone other than New York and Indiana, and those are the two people who came up first. Vegas, by a slim margin, led the league last year. Their second best scorer is gone. And we'll see how Jewel goes there and if she can recapture some of her play before. But sort of discounting them, again, New York finished right behind them. Their scheme in the preseason it's way faster. It's a lot of transition play. They brought over an assistant from the Memphis Grizzlies, and you have a lot of sort of NBA pace and concepts here. I think that's going to help. And, Indiana added who they added to an offense that was already pretty lethal. What ended up happening in terms of the selections here, again, it looks pretty similar. New York was the overwhelming favorite for best offense. Indiana number 2, Vegas number 3, and Minnesota got a spare vote there as well. That's the top 4 who were in offense last year. As far as best defense, Minnesota is pretty clear-cut favorite. They were the best defense last year. New York and Phoenix pulled them up. Phoenix added Alyssa Thomas. So there's reason to have faith in her. Always is.
Yeah. And, one thing that, just kind of reading through our previews, I know I wanted to ask you, how do you think first-year Atlanta Dream head coach Carl Smesko's philosophy is going to translate to the WNBA level? And related, we've already seen Brittany Griner shooting threes during the preseason. So, how do you think all of that's going to come together? And do you think the philosophy is going to work at the WNBA level?
The philosophy is mostly just hunt efficient shots and play athletes who can do stuff to get there. The roster is interesting because it doesn't translate to what he did in terms of personnel at FGCU. So you're looking at, at FGCU, you would maybe even have Ryan Howard playing something like the 5. Instead, she's still at the 3. Alicia's still at the 2. Which, even in a modern system, you'd bump them both down a position. And you're playing 2 centers, which he barely ever played with 1 center in college. It's the same sort of concepts, at least that's what it's looked like in the preseason, the same concepts in terms of we're hunting layups, we're hunting spot up threes. Occasionally the right players can take pull up threes, very rarely in the mid range. And I mean, that can work if you have the right players. It's interesting, certainly with this lineup and this roster specifically, because, as you're familiar with, Bree Jones is obviously a very solid mid-range shooter. She needs that to be able to, move around in space. Brittany Griner is solid there as well. Nate Tibbetts tried to get BG behind line. She was, and she hit, enough to keep the defenses honest. If she can keep going in this direction, it really opens up things for how that can work. I'm excited to see it. I'm not writing it off.
Awesome. Well, coming up next, we'll keep talking about the next preseason predictions and some of our other preseason thoughts. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. The NBA season is at its peak, and with the playoffs heating up, now's the time to put your sports knowledge to work with PrizePicks, the top platform for daily fantasy sports. PrizePicks makes it easy. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections and you're in. Whether it's points, rebounds, or assists, you've got a shot to win up to 2,000 times your entry. The app takes less than 60 seconds to use, and I love how I can mix and match basketball players with other sports like baseball or esports in the same lineup. And when you hit your picks, the payout hits fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Tuesdays are even better with Taco Tuesday, where player projections are discounted up to 25% for even more value. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Okay, so rapid fire. Who did the Knicks select as our MVP, Defensive Player of the Year? And I know there's still some math going on behind the scenes. Who's looking like the front runner for 6th Player of the Year?
First, I'll turn that to you. Still rapid fire. Who did you think was going to be MVP?
I got a little preview of the results, and I was a little bit surprised just in how, having seen the preseason predictions, we've kind of seen the same group of players. So I was a little surprised to see that Nafisa Collier was the collective preseason pick for MVP. Obviously, I don't disagree, having seen how she played last season and then continued to play in Unrivaled. But it was a surprise just based off of kind of the collection we've seen over the last couple of years with Asia Wilson and Breanna Stewart.
Yeah, and it wasn't in the voting last year for MVP. She finishes second. It was the first time, I think, in 3 years. The top 2 wasn't. No, because she finished. No, Asia. Sorry, it's the first time that I think Breanna Stewart specifically wasn't top 2 in like 3 years or something. It's a pretty close margin between her and Asia in terms of our preseason voting. And, that kind of makes sense given what Stewie looked like down the stretch last year. The shot for the past couple of years in the playoffs has kind of faded. She's still obviously one of the best players in the league, but it is, I think, a little jarring. I genuinely, until I did this, I forgot that she finished 3rd in MVP voting last year and not 2nd, because I'm just so used to it being Asia, Stewie 1-2, aside from, I think that's like the almost 3-way tie year. So used to that since basically like 2020 that it's almost jarring. Defensive Player of the Year, unsurprising. It's basically who you expect to be the top 3 defenders in the league. It's Asia, who won back-to-back before. Asia's the preseason pick. She won back-to-back awards before. Nafisa Collier's number 2. She won last year before Alyssa Thomas, who always a bridesmaid, never a bride when it comes to this one.
That's what I was going to bring up next. Of like, is there anything else that Alyssa Thomas needs to do to win Defensive Player of the Year? Or do you think her being traded to Phoenix changes how we might think about her? And, there's no way to kind of spit out any answers in that formula until we see her in Phoenix play in some regular season games.
It's tough. I mean, I feel like after the past couple of years, she had been my pick once or twice in terms of postseason voting. It feels like at this point, probably needs not only she's obviously going to be the best defender on pretty much whatever team she's on, but she not only needs that, she needs her team to finish with the best defense in the league and to have some sort of career high in like steals and blocks per game. I mean, just given her shoulders, just given the fact that she's never been a vertical athlete, she doesn't get blocks. She obviously gets steals, but the ways she impacts the game, I think are so tend to be so. They pop visually, but they don't pop in terms of the block numbers. And block numbers often tend to be one of the biggest things historically that voters always go for in these kind of awards. It's tough. It is really hard to say at this point, other than finish first in defensive rating and have it be a surprise.
And then, kind of shifting the tables a little bit, who do you think is going to be the most impactful free agency addition this year? Or, was it kind of across the board in our voting?
It was really across the board. This is a question I ask every year, and it often feels weird to ask it because there's always like people interpret this very differently, right? So the best player who moved teams during the offseason was Alyssa Thomas, of course. She's, top 3, top 4 player in the league. And she moved teams. So she's probably, at least in terms of like on court, on off, like statistical impact, probably going to be the most impactful free agent. Some people interpret it like how much do you change the team you're going to, which I guess would also still be Alyssa Thomas, but some people on that logic went for Brittany Griner. Some people think of it as like, who makes the most like sort of marginal difference in terms of maybe visual impact. Some people went for Natasha Cloud because New York, is going to be, like we said, preseason title favorite. So you have sort of like high leverage with that move. There's a couple others in there, but I think the different interpretations tend to make it look kind of weird, but it's interesting. It's at least it's a nice excuse to put in a little table in here to remind people of some big names that moved.
I'm definitely one of the people that interprets it the first way. I believe I voted Alyssa Thomas, and I think historically I voted, biggest name to move teams, but then, turning our eyes to the draft, and, you're one of our draft experts, outside of the lottery picks, who do you think will be the most impactful draftees this season?
See, that's an interesting question just because of the way this class was set up, right? So obviously Paige is Paige, and then Malanga is probably, just given her age, going to come along slow. There's definitely a strong chance, especially with Jordan Canada out for an as yet undetermined timetable, that Tina Paopao could really come on strong for Atlanta. Assuming that the reasons for her, sliding into like the mid to late second round don't tend to pan out. If some teams look foolish, she could end up honestly starting for sorry, I forgot the name of the team, the Dream, for a little while. And I think that's a really high leverage situation there. Obviously, both Sinai Rivers and Anissa Morrow in Connecticut probably both going to end up starting some games this year. You're going to get a lot of run, especially given the people on that team, and that'll be interesting to see. You'll get a lot of chances to play through mistakes.
Coming up next, we'll take a look back on the preseason and chat about what excites the both of us about the upcoming regular season. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like the start of the WNBA season, and this season is one you're going to want to experience live. If you want in, Game Time makes it fast and easy to get seats. Prices on the app actually drop closer to tip-off, and with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees, Game Time is a total game changer. I was just on the app looking at tickets for Saturday's Las Vegas Aces versus New York Liberty game and saw some great deals. I love that I can see my exact view from my seat before I buy, no surprises. And with the Game Time guarantee, you know you're getting the best deal. If you find a better price in the same row and section, they'll credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So, has anything surprised you in the preseason? Cuts, players making the roster. I know some rosters haven't been finalized at the time of recording, but has anything surprised you or even play in preseason games?
I've had some pleasant surprises, honestly. A lot of the games were more fun than I was expecting, especially Golden State's and Phoenix's. Phoenix's, I wish that I could remember her first name, but Phoenix is possibly starting point guard. We'll see what happens when the season rolls along. European Akol Makani, that's her last name, is very interesting. She could be a really good defender. She's been a really solid player in the EuroLeague before. And, that's a team that has a lot of pieces that they're just trying to see, frankly, what happens with. We know they have Ka, we know they have Satu, we know they have AT, and they're probably going to end up playing Mac the most minutes at the 5. And then everything else behind them is pretty much up for grabs. Laxa has a guaranteed contract. Sammy, they paid to come over, but those players have to make shots to stick in the rotation. And Akol Makani for me has played really well in their preseason game, and I'm looking forward to what she does there. As far as other teams today, basically, well, not when you're listening to this yesterday, basically shortly before we recorded, Haley Jones got cut, which is not entirely surprising given, she has continued to look as she did at Stanford, which was sort of borderline as it was. It's interesting that they're cutting her to keep Taylor Theory. That's going to be sort of fun. That's an interesting project there. There are a couple other ones I think across the league that there's just a lot of new, interesting players. I think the whole Saturday Pod crew, big fans of Janelle Salone from France. Really excited to see her in Golden State, and I think this is the first preseason I can remember where a lot of the players who we thought were sort of marginal fits with rosters actually kind of all made it. I'm thinking of Salone. I'm thinking of Oleri Kosu in Minnesota. I'm thinking of JJ Quinterly in Dallas. Like, pretty much all of them made the rosters.
And then, back to the topic of Phoenix, one of those fun bonus questions was, similar to one you had asked last year about the WNBA without Candace Parker. Now it's the WNBA without Diana Taurasi. What were some of the responses? If you can share them, if not, also totally understand.
Well, a couple people definitely said they were sad. A few people said they were weird. We had one hater who said the vibes had never been better, which I love the energy. I don't know if I agree, but I love the energy. People mostly just, it feels different. Maybe sad, maybe weird, but it just feels different. Same thing about Candace.
You mentioned this earlier with the New York Liberty and Minnesota matchup being one of the things that the people were most excited for. I'm one of those people. I'm a little basic. I love a finals rematch. But what other regular season matchups are we at the next looking forward to this season?
It's not to the top of the list, but one that I thought that was very fun that genuinely I hadn't thought of until I was tallying up everyone else's votes. The Valkyries' first game as a franchise, their opening game is thankfully at home. Good on the league for that. It's also against Sparks, so we're kicking off an interstate rivalry, or intrastate. We're kicking off an intrastate rivalry with that, and that's super fun on opening night for the league. Getting that's great. A couple other, unsurprisingly, Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is up there. A lot of people for Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers. The New York Las Vegas rivalry is probably the best like team to team rivalry we have in the league right now. And then a couple people voted for sort of revenge games for different trades. Vegas against Seattle, Vegas against Los Angeles, those sorts of things.
And then, what are you excited to watch for this season?
I'm always excited for like when the most interesting bad teams play. So like it's like Washington has a lot of players worth watching. They're not going to be good. They're actually going to be terrible, but they have a lot of players worth watching. It's basically the same deal with Golden State. And there's a solid chance they could both be terrible in like fun ways. So like Golden State Washington is something I'm like really excited for because, New York, Minnesota, Indiana, Dallas, these are going to be stressful. There's a lot at stake. On the other hand, when you have like Golden State, Washington, you can watch like a bunch of young players do some really fun stuff and some really stupid stuff, and none of it really matters. And that's great. We all need to like take a time out from responsibilities and expectations at times.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the season as a whole, I'm interested to see, there's 8 coaches that weren't head coaches with their respective teams at this time last year, including Golden State. So I'm interested to see how each coach performs and if there's a lot of turnover again next offseason, and maybe a bit of a pattern starts with shorter tenures for head coaches.
Yeah, not only that, but in terms of the 8 you mentioned, 7 of them have never coached a WNBA game before. This is an unprecedented amount of turnover and like an unprecedented amount of new blood. I don't like that. That sounds really weird. An unprecedented amount of just like new faces in the league in terms of coaching. A bunch of them have been assistants. A bunch of them, have been around the league before. But it's a different mix of things, and it's nice to have some variety at least.
Yeah, and definitely interested to see, how it all works out, and will there be a lot of first and second year head coaches that don't end up getting second and third years? I always think more time is sometimes a good thing, but seeing how that pattern continues. Any other things like that you're excited to watch for?
It's a great question. There's a lot of young players, not only the rookie class we talked about, like I said, with Paige, Pow, and then some of the sort of marginal cases in terms of like I said, with Kosu and Quinterly. I think just really excited to see how things play out in the mid-pack of the league. Both me and our voters have absolutely no idea what's going to happen with Phoenix. I think there are sometimes, it didn't happen this year, but there are sometimes teams that will get votes for like both best offense and best and worst offense, and like the same thing with defense. It can be pretty close. I want to see what happens with them. How good is Dallas going to be with a slightly different and possibly equally weird starting lineup, and I guess rotation in terms of like having too many forwards again. You have teams sitting there like that. Seattle is again playing like a bunch of wings at the 2. They don't really have a good backup point guard. There's a lot of weird stuff that's going to happen with the mid-pack, and it's going to be very, on like a night-to-night basis, it's probably going to be almost hilariously inconsistent, and that's fun. That's fun.
You're just excited for some very sicko things to happen, and I say that as someone who is really excited for you to share all of those things that you're seeing with all of us and telling us when we should be watching for them.
I could be excited for like good basketball, but like here's the thing. I live in New York City. I literally live within vaguely walking distance of the Barclays Center. I'm credentialed for the season. So like, of course I'm gonna watch all their games and they're gonna play good basketball. They're gonna play other good teams. So that almost becomes mundane. What I really look forward to is the terribleness.
A great philosophy just for life to, not just go for the thing right in front of you, look for excitement and good things everywhere. Where can the people find you and your work if they want to know about all of these things beyond just the New York Liberty and some of the top teams to watch?
Of course. So I will, starting this weekend, be resuming my weekly series, Sunday Notes. This will, of course, include legitimate observations about teams, thoughts on player development across the league, randomly pulling up a role player from 2006 and 2013 and 2017 all at the same time, and then generally some like weird jokes that I can think of that have to do with the league. That's about what that amounts to. You can also, of course, find me on the Saturday podcast along with Hunter Cruz and Lincoln Schaefer. After we, in between observations on rookies this year, we're going to be finishing up last summer's series on all-time greats who were underdrafted, and then we will move on to a secret new project, assuming that we get through that first one, which we started last summer. And then you can intermittently find me on Blue Sky at emilyadler.bsky.social. I am on there sometimes.
Also, how I feel about Blue Sky. I am on there sometimes. Try to be.
I'm not always on there, but you can probably always reach me on there, which is probably not the right availability to have, but it's not.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On NBA Game Night. Every game, every night until an NBA champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find NBA Game Night on Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts.